My name's Taylor Ernst, 2024 California Lawyer Attorney of the Year, $63 million verdict, wrote the book, The Ernst Way, The Definitive Guide on TBI Litigation, which is coming out soon. Additionally, one of the things that you need to know about me is I am giving help to lawyers across the country. I've probably helped more than 100 lawyers and asked for nothing in return. Just help them on their TBI cases. So that's it. Let's get to it. Normal CT scan, real brain injury. It's something that I see over and over again in lots of cases, and it gets misunderstood so often by lawyers, by clients, by defense counsel, because the really sophisticated neurologists for the defense always will start reports and say, there was a normal CT scan. There was no blood on the brain. There was nothing that was worried about on that CT scan. And they say it in a way with such conviction that it creates confusion kind of throughout the case, because really what a CT scan is that's done in the ER is determining whether there's blood or a bleed in the brain that needs emergency surgery. That's it. And so when there is that declarative statement, it confuses everyone. And I know this because I've been meeting with clients before, and the parent of a young pediatric kid will sit in my office and tell me something along the lines of, well, the surgeon told me there was no bleed in the brain and therefore my kid's fine. And a number of things happen with that because number one, it's bias confirmation. The parent, all they want is to have some doctor with a lab coat to say, your kid's fine. I've looked at the scans, I've looked at the thing, and one of the parents actually told me this. This is a case that's settled and gone and not disclosing any names or anything, but one of the parents told me there was no bleed in the brain and the kid was fine when there was a 7mm midline shift in the brain, which in the scale of significance of a brain injury, it's so severe that it usually causes a coma, it usually causes death. It will almost without a doubt have lasting long-term consequences to it. But the confusion came from her bias confirmation. She wanted to know and be told that her son was fine. And therefore, when it came out that she was told by a doctor that there was no bleed on the CT scan, she jumped to the conclusion of, therefore, there's not a significant injury here, which couldn't be further from the truth, unfortunately. And so when I'm talking with other lawyers, when I'm talking with clients, when I'm talking with people, the framework is when there's a negative CT scan, that just means no bleed and no emergency surgery. That's it. It doesn't detect axonal shearing. It doesn't detect the micro injuries that can be widespread or diffuse throughout the brain. The definition of a traumatic brain injury is one that you should be able to use inherently. And if I were to define traumatic brain injury, it would be an external force that goes through the brain that causes long-term cognitive injury. Notice in that definition that I just gave, there isn't anything about it shows up on a CT scan. There isn't anything about it showing up on an MRI scan. It's something that any defense doctor will agree with this statement. Doctor, can't you have a brain injury and have a negative CT scan? Yes. Doctor, isn't it true you can have a negative MRI scan and still have a brain injury? Yes. And the reason for that is these things happen at such a small microscopic level is they're only showing up on these type of scans, like the CT if there's a bleed, the MRI if the lesion or problems in the brain are big enough to be picked up. Especially if it's diffuse, sometimes they'll be there, but sometimes they won't. And what we will know is there's been enough force through the person's brain that there are long-term significant cognitive results from it. And they're observable. All the people around them will say they're different. Their personalities change. Their vision has problems. Their memory isn't the same. They get lost. They shouldn't be left alone. They shouldn't be cooking. They have all this laundry list of things that's fundamentally different. And the defense will stand up and say, look, clean CT scan, and look, clean MRI, with such conviction that lawyers inherently doubt whether or not their case is as good as they feel like it is. And if you define a CT scan as looking for a bleed on the brain, if it's negative to show there's a bleed in the brain, that doesn't really tell you one way or another if there is a brain injury. And so when they say that's a negative CT scan, just translate it in your head of no bleed in the brain. Now, let me tell you about a story of when I first learned this. I had a client that was sitting in my office that I hadn't looked at her medical records. And as she sat in my office, it was very obvious she had a brain injury. There was a lot of observable things that were wrong. tremors, her speech having significant impairment, difficulty finding words, difficulty even remembering parts of the conversation that we had. And I was a younger lawyer. I'd only been a lawyer for a year or two. And I remember getting her medical records and looking at the CT scan for the first time. And I'm looking at the paper and I'm holding it up and it says CT scan, no abnormal intracranial abnormalities. And I struggled to say it and I'm looking at the words and I'm Googling them and trying to figure out what that means. It doesn't mean no brain injury. And at the time, I remember the friction I hit. Immediately, I'm looking at it going, well, if it says no intracranial abnormalities, that means no brain injury. But she sat in my office and it was obvious she had one. And so I had these two different competing things happening to me because I didn't know what I know now, which is you can have both, where then I didn't. And I remember looking at the report and thinking about the client, looking at the report and thinking about the client and being like, how does it say no brain injury? But I personally observed the brain injury. It caused confusion in me, which inherently made me think the value of the case was significantly less. And that's what I want to teach. That's what I want you to understand, that it doesn't mean the client's case is worth less. It just means there's no bleed. It has nothing to do with whether there's long-term cognitive impairment if you look at the definition the way I gave it. And because of that, as soon as you understand that you're not looking for the CT finding, if you have a CT finding, you're doing a different type of brain injury case. It's going to be focused much more on the bleed, where the bleed was, and pro tip for you out there, if you do have a bleed case, it isn't about how big the bleed is. It's about where the bleed is located. Because you can have a bleed in one area of the brain and have personality changes of memory impairment, or you can have a bleed in another part of the brain where there is long-term, locked in, trapped. They can't move any part of their body except their eyes. And so the nuance between it is pretty different. And everyone wants to say, oh, there's a bleed in the brain. Well, the question is, where was the bleed in the brain? And it's not a how big is it, it's what area of the brain was affected. Getting back to it, if it's not a picture of the bleed in the brain, you really are working with what is the evidence that I need to find to prove there's a brain injury here? Because just because the CT is negative doesn't mean anything about the quality of the life that they're going to have as a result from the impairment that is documented by the real world. And so people are like, well, if there's negative CT scan and there's not much in the medical records, this is the reason that brain injury cases can be difficult, is because a lot of times it isn't easy to just skim through the medical records and know what the value of the case is. You have to do significant outside work of the medical records because you're looking for real life to prove the brain injury, not necessarily the doctor who came in the ER and saw him for 15 minutes and goes, well, yeah, I think you had a mild traumatic brain injury, a moderate brain injury, but the CT is normal and I'm going to send you home. Two different cases. You really need to focus on lining up where the evidence is. And just because negative bleed doesn't mean negative brain injury. And with that, I'll see you next time on TBI Lawyer Secrets.